My name is Tino Cuellar. I'm the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
So, Tino, the question we have for you is very simple. We basically want to know, in your mind, why do the Mexican elections matter for Mexico? Why do the Mexican elections matter for the U.S.?
Well, let's remember that the United States is a country with interests all over the world and an economy that's interconnected with Asia, with Europe, with Africa. But in this hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, there has been a particular history of a recognition on the side of the United States and many countries in Latin America that the futures of their entire region means that the countries are interdependent, that they're interlinked to some degree. And nowhere in Latin America is that more true than with Mexico, where there are hundreds of miles of borders, where there are millions of Americans who have strong ties to Mexico, where Mexico has become a particularly massive trading partner of the United States, the largest trading partner, now that the trade with China has declined given the trade and other tensions with China, and where the law enforcement and rule of law interests of the United States and Mexico in some cases converge. So you have recognition that the well-being of the United States, the relationship of the US to the larger world, and a set of issues that many Americans care deeply about, including their security, migration, and economic prosperity are all interconnected to Mexico.
So a second question for you is, if you compare it to U.S. elections, how vibrant do you think Mexican democracy is these days?
Well, it's quite intense and lively, that's for sure. There was much participation. There were many, many people out in the Zócalo. There are lots of political communications in Mexico. It's important to recognize that although there is a similarity in Mexican and American democracy, there are also some important differences. Mexico has a different historical trajectory. Mexico has had its struggles with democracy more recently. The struggles the US has had with democracy are both old and new. In the olden days, not everybody in the US had a chance to vote in free elections. There were people in the South going back to the Jim Crow era that didn't have direct access to the franchise. And now, what has been a fairly long tradition in the US of relatively stable election outcomes without much controversy has given way to a lot of disinformation and some concern expressed at times about whether the outcome of American elections will be widely respected. Something further complicated by the fact that sometimes elections can be very close. I think the larger point would be that in both countries, you have democratic processes that have withstood attacks and efforts to undermine the institutions, but that in both countries also you see that the success of democracy depends not only on formal legal arrangements, whether they be electoral institutes or courts or prosecutors making sure people don't engage in corruption around elections, but also those processes depend on norms, on traditions, on habits of behavior that people have. And then I would add that an important distinction, and one that I'm sure will be much at issue in discussions of Mexican democracy in the months to come, has to do with the risk of violence that candidates for office face. In the US, well, we have many ways in which our democracy could improve even more over time. Generally speaking, the act of running for office, whether at the local, at the state, or the federal level, is not an act that exposes one to great risk, although there are some risks. People have gotten hurt in the US context, but the combination of law enforcement and norms have made that somewhat less common. In Mexico, even as democracy has improved over the years, one of the key areas for further development of democracy will be securing the well-being of candidates who choose to run for office, even if they might disagree with or raise concerns about agendas that might upset people who might choose in some way to target or threaten those candidates.
Thank you, Tino. I do want to ask one more question, but this one I want to switch to Spanish. And basically, lo que quiero preguntarte, Tino, es cómo te sientes de tener a la primera presidenta mujer en México, y te lo pregunto en español porque es una pregunta de sentimientos más que análisis.
Aquí en mi país de Estados Unidos hemos hecho muchos progresos pasando el tiempo en crear un sistema político más equitativo, pero si alguien me hubiese dicho hace muchos años, cuando estaba creciendo en México, que iba a haber una presidenta mujer en México antes que en Estados Unidos, hubiera estado muy sorprendido. Creo que este es un momento muy interesante para México, un momento que refleja que el mundo se está abriendo un poco más y que cada vez más los gobernantes reflejan un poquito más a la población.
Tino, quisiera hacerte una pregunta así, esta vez en inglés, porque ya no es tanto de emociones, sino un poco más analítico. Um, a lot of commentators in Mexico have sort of talked about the potential of U.S.-Mexico relations, yeah, facing issues depending on the outcomes of the U.S. elections in the fall. How do you see the prospect of U.S.-Mexico relations depending on the outcomes of the presidential election in the U.S. in November?
Well, in principle, there are many common interests that Mexico and the United States have. They ought to have an interest in keeping borders well protected and secured, and in making economies vibrant, and in letting the peoples of Mexico and the United States share in an ever more prosperous hemispheric economy. That's good for both countries, and it's frankly good for the world. The reality is, of course, that who governs matters, and people who are in appointed or elected office can have different perspectives. And I just have found in my history of thinking about these issues that it's useful for the people who represent these different countries to have a good understanding of the history and understand how important it is to try to keep a respectful dialogue and a set of relationships that reflect those shared interests rather than a whole bunch of different distractions that can get entangled with rhetoric that can be divisive at the end of the day. I mean, if you take a big picture perspective on this, the entire world faces giant challenges around climate, around how to best make use of the dramatic changes in technology around us, around geopolitical fragmentation, around keeping supply chains secure, around keeping the public safe and healthy. And amidst all that, a robust partnership between Mexico and the US, respectful of both interests, is very good for the hemisphere. And at core, ultimately, what that depends on is a recognition that if Mexican democracy is vibrant and if Mexico is progressing economically, that generally will benefit Mexicans and will benefit Americans as well.
Thank you so much, Tino. This is wonderful that we had a chance to exchange some views. Is there anything you would like to add? Any message that you think you should touch upon that we didn't ask you about?
It's also important to realize that both Mexico and the United States are federal countries. And that means that not all the important decisions are being made in Washington, D.C. or in Mexico City. At the end of the day, in places like Monterrey, Guadalajara, Tijuana, Puebla, there are important issues that get resolved and that ultimately reflect the strength of a more complicated system. The whole process of making Mexican federalism vibrant and successful is a challenging one and cannot be taken for granted. But similarly, in the United States, the US government is the key actor in shaping American relationships abroad. But on key issues involving climate and technology, for example, you have a really critical role played by states. And so having these states learn from each other and be in productive conversations will be useful as well.